All right, hello everybody. I think we're going to have to go some way in order to match the expertise and also the excitement of that first panel. My name is Ann Lin. As I said earlier, I'm the Lieberthal-Rogel Professor for Chinese Studies here at and I am really delighted to be moderating today's panel. Um, let me let me start by by sharing an experience. So right before Trump was elected in Trump won, I took a group of students to China and we had a session at the American consulate in Shanghai. And my students, who were, of course, were all Clinton supporters, were astonished to hear that China might prefer Trump. And our diplomats said, look, Chinese are transactional. Trump is a businessman. They think that he will not be held back by, these antiquated notions of, diplomatic relationships and, human rights and all of these things that, aren't very important. They think that he's really just going to focus on, can we make a deal? And Chinese can make a deal. So that I think was a really fantastic introduction for my students into really saying, it's not just that, America has interests and other countries have interests and, we, are trying to advance our own interests, et cetera, but that really people in other countries, leaders in other countries can have sort of fundamentally different lenses. The lenses to make some of the issues that we care about seem, unimportant or side issues, some of the issues that we, or some of the what we think of as win-win solutions, less less win or more win, depending on what that particular lens comes from. And so it was an astonishingly successful visit, even though it made our students feel very depressed. Um, the other incident that I really want to just touch on is, again, from Trump 1. People who are China hands will remember that one of the first calls President Trump took was a call from President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, congratulating him. And this, blew China hands away. He can't do that. He's not allowed to do that. How can he talk to the president of Taiwan as if she were the president of a country? And this is going to torpedo our relationship with the Chinese, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it turns out that, one of the reasons that he, took the call was that he had advisors who were from, you now really have to be old to remember this, but Senator Robert Dole's staff, old stalwart Republican Senate Majority Leader, who World War II, excuse me, it's not that old, World War II hero, who, was very much a, nationalist, pro-nationalist China, pro-KMT, anti-communist, we lost China, how do we, support freedom and democracy in China by bringing, by recapturing the mainland and making China free. And so it was just another really fascinating example of how, for the Chinese, this was, what is Trump trying to signal? And for the Americans, this was, how did these advisors get onto Trump's, list of foreign policy people? So, with those in mind, I think we are just really extraordinarily lucky to have an opportunity to discuss what China relations might look like with Trump in the presidency again. And I'm really excited by the people that we are joined by to have this conversation. So Mark Magnier is deputy editor for, deputy bureau chief for the United States for the South China Morning Post, a position he's held since 2019. He has previously worked for the Wall Street Journal, where he was head of the economics desk for China and Taiwan, and then also for the Los Angeles Times, where he served as a foreign correspondent in China, in India, in Japan, and we're really lucky to have his experience here. I also want to point out that although Mark got his BA and MA from Columbia University, we're happy to think of him as a Michigan man because he was up here in a previous class of Knight Wallace Fellows. So thank you very much for coming back to Ann Arbor. I also want to introduce Ying Sun. Ying Sun is the director of the China, sorry, let me try that again. She's director of China for the Stimson Center, one of Washington, D.C.'s most respected independent foreign policy think tanks. And she's also co-director of the East Asia program there. Before coming to Stimson, she was at the Brookings Institution and also in Beijing for the International Crisis Group. She received an MA from George Washington University and also a BA and MA from China Foreign Relations University. So I am going to turn it over to them. We've asked each to talk about 15 minutes, and then we will have, as with the previous panel, questions from the audience. I hope questions from those of you who are on Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us on Zoom. And maybe a couple of questions from me to sort of pull the conversation together. So Mark, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be back in Ann Arbor. It's been 6 years now. Thank you very much for that introduction, Ann, and thank you to the centers and all of the people that did so much work to bring this together. In addition to the honorary Michigan status that I have, having done, I came to the Knight Wallace Journalism Fellowship after 20 years in Asia. And so in many ways it was a really invaluable opportunity to get to know my own country again and to take a kind of a slow walk into what had happened. This was 2018. But in addition to that, my mother's entire family is from Michigan. She was a black sheep and left and moved to New York and married a Catholic in those days. And so I never knew them. And it was an amazing opportunity to spend a year also getting to know my extended family. And in classic American fashion, half of them are Trump supporters, half of them are not, and you'll be shocked to know they don't talk to each other. So, so that was part of my introduction back. So I'd like to sort of divide my comments into two parts. I just wrapped up in December a 3-week East-West Center Jefferson Fellowship for Journalists, looking at the Indo-Pacific and the security issues in some depth. And it took us to Honolulu to some extent to meet with Indo-Pacific, the PACOM folks in the military who are overlooking all of the region, as well as to Manila for a week, where we went aboard one of the Coast Guard vessels that's at the front lines of the Chinese confrontation tactics and gray zone tactics, and then to Taipei, and also to Quemoy and Kinmen, which are right on the front lines there of 6 miles, 10 kilometers from China. And so a lot of issues there. So I'll look at that, as well as just some broader reflections on the U.S.-China relationship, more from the Washington perspective. Of course, Yun is far more expert, and we'll have proper good insights from her after me. So just to start a little bit with what came out of my swing through the Indo-Pacific region. Both of these economies, if you will, are on the front lines. They are facing near daily harassment. I think they're interesting in the context of what Johannes was talking about in being not the US, not China. They are more in the US camp, but they are also trying to navigate here. And so essentially what they are looking at they're coming out of 4 years of the Biden administration, which, as we know, was much more conventional foreign policy, which worked very hard, I think, to really empower the allies and partners strategy as a way to counter China. And so both of them are big recipients, I think, of that love and attention that they did get from them. We've also operated in a context where, which I covered in November of 2023, where the U.S. really tried to make sure that there were guardrails around the U.S.-China relationship so that it did not go completely off the rails, even as we are competing on all these areas and brushing up against each other militarily. So they're looking at, as we heard so well from Seema and Michael in the first session, we're all looking at the same equation here with Trump. We're all sort of trying to read the runes, the stones, the tea leaves. And so everybody, I think, in all sorts of capitals are taking the same equation and trying to get to the conclusion that suits their own national interest. And so I saw that in both of these capitals. And so if you look at it, transactional, a deal maker, someone who has pounded the U.S. allies during his first term on not spending enough for their own defense, as Seema said, freeloaders, and very, very concerned with trade surpluses, a kind of a zero-sum view of trade oftentimes, that any sort of trade surplus is something that is ripping the U.S. off. So when these two try to counter that and figure out how to navigate, I think they had a surprisingly similar approach in some ways from the various people we talked to. One is that we are probably going to have to depend less on Washington. This idea of a beneficent U.S. that has a global policeman role, that's probably going away, even without Trump, but it's getting too expensive in many ways. So the counter on that, I think that both places are looking at, are really trying to improve their relationship with most insight. Surprisingly, I didn't hear much about trying to improve things with India. It was Australia, South Korea, Japan, and then many of the European countries that have been more and more interested in the Indo-Pacific as they realize that some $3 trillion worth of trade goes to the region, and that it's a small world, and they have a vested interest. And so when they look at this, you can't snap your fingers and reduce a trade surplus or what have you. There are real big structural issues that are affecting this, including currency and U.S. demand and what have you. But Taiwan in particular has been the brunt of some of Trump's campaigning on the trail, saying that they stole our chips and that they are a bunch of rich guys that are not paying their way. When you look at their defense spending, they're currently spending approximately 2.5% of GDP, about $20 billion. Trump has called for them to do 10% of GDP. So in the calculation, okay, Trump loves to be the deal maker, 10%, maybe that's actually 5%, and maybe we can do 3%. That's sort of the calculation, some of the calculations that are going on. And on the Philippines, they have rather unfortunately just reduced their defense budget by about 16% from the proposed levels, and they are less than 1%. Mind you, Taiwan, which is likely to get the brunt of this, compares with most European countries, which their average is about 1.6% compared to 2.5%. And so, but obviously with the Taiwan Relations Act and this being in many ways the focal point with China, that there is a strong insecurity in Taiwan that Trump could sell them out. And then on the trade side, in the same way, both of them have seen their trade surpluses go up. Unfortunately, in the last little bit, Taiwan rather dramatically in the first 10 months of 2024, they've had a surplus of 49 billion, up from 35 billion from the same period a year ago. Manila, a smaller increase, but also in the wrong direction from Trump's standpoint, about 3.7 billion compared to 3.5 billion a year ago. So when they look at this, when they look at the equation, when they look at what they think Trump will want, and they, of course, think if the searchlight comes our way, we've got to do enough to maybe get him to move the searchlight elsewhere. You have essentially a scenario where, okay, we will hope to buy a lot more weapons that will make us look less like freeloaders, and hopefully that will bring the deficit down enough, the trade surplus down enough that will more or less please him for the time being. Both of them also stake a lot, and sometimes it felt a bit like wishful, hopeful thinking, but grounded in a strong basis that in the end, Congress we have very good friends on the Hill. We've had very good friends for a long time. We will be able, in the end of the day, to prevail on that. Then, if we turn a little bit to the U.S.-China relationship and what we're likely to face on that, and again, Yun can speak a lot more on this, but it's a kind of a split screen. It's kind of a disconnect, really, in some ways, where you have pretty serious China hawks that have been named to the administration. Marco Rubio, Hegseth for defense, Greer at the USTR, and Mike Waltz at the NSC. And so you have this. And we saw in the first term that a lot of this work, when Trump wasn't paying attention, really was able to grindingly toughen ties with China. The other side of that, of course, is Mr. Transaction, art of the deal man. And my colleagues referenced that a bit, that he really could and has a lot of incentive to sweep in and do a big deal, do some grand bargain. Working against that, which the Chinese have got to probably prevail should that happen, and I think it's relatively low percentage, is that the U.S. really did not, China did not fulfill its part of the bargain under these phase 1 and phase 2 trade agreements that we saw just before the election that Trump really wanted to use. Since he has no compunctions about managed trade or global rules, this is something that I think you could see. When you look at the two countries and sort of how we got here, there are some kind of interesting similarities, I think, between the U.S. and China. They're both have a strong belief in their exceptionalism, that they are special, that they are deserved, that they have a rightful place, for better or for worse. Behind that is ambition. I think they're both obviously very entrepreneurial and hardworking cultures. Another reflection is they both have a unhealthy obsession with money and work. That they share that. Differences, obviously, a very different political structure, ideology, and a degree of formality. So I've sort of been lucky enough to have a bit of a front row seat on some of this evolution. My first assignment in China was to around 2000 for the WTO accession. Then my assignment my posting was from 2003 to 2009, which was the incredible explosive growth period. And then the second round with the Wall Street Journal was from 2014 to 2017, as some of the barnacles that had inevitably built up with such a fast growth picture really began to come to the fore. And we're seeing that play out now with the real estate crisis, with youth unemployment, with demographics, with many of the problems that followed that. And between those two, the 5 years between, I was posted in India because if you don't have 1 billion people around, you get kind of lonely. So I needed to keep that going. So from China's perspective, when you look at sort of the misconceptions and some of the problems that have led to us getting here, I think one of the, particularly after the global financial crisis, one of the I think sort of missteps that China has done is that, you know, Deng Xiaoping had always advised that you hide your strengths and bide your time. And I think not just Xi Jinping, but I think the collective, looking at the West, looking at the collapse of the US banking system and real estate, concluded that our time is here, the West is done, and it's time for China to rise. And so you then saw this manifest with, I think, a number of policies that I would argue have not helped or been beneficial to Beijing. This grab for the South China Sea and the islands and the militarization of that, that may work out in the end. We'll have to see if they can prevail, but it certainly didn't help their reputation. The wolf warrior diplomatic campaign, where they just seem to just pick fights. All of the territorial disputes that they have revved up, you know, India obviously being one of those. And then siding with Russia on the Ukraine issue, which I think has really rattled Europe, which they were always able to divide and conquer and try to use Europe against the US, and have been, I think, a bit set back by how strong the Europe-US coalition has been able to unify under Biden. So I think those are some of those. I think on the U.S. side, the misconception, among the misconceptions we've seen, is that the U.S. had watched, I covered much of the period of when Japan was rising, and this was, I think, a real psychological, well, Detroit obviously had this big time, but a real psychological change in America's viewpoint of itself, and real depression and a feeling that they were finished. They then, I think, adapted, stopped trying to do quality circles and all these silly things, and eventually found their own feet with Bill Gates in a garage and what exploded into Silicon Valley. And then you had the four geese, and then you had ASEAN. And I think the US developed this mindset that, okay, we'll help them open, and then they will become like us and increasingly politically democratic and all good. And I think what China has done is question that. I think there's a deep problem there that the U.S. has to face, that it has not been able to really grapple with a very different system that they have to make room for. And I think this will play out even more so with the Trump administration 2.0. So looking at kind of I do not see much chance for win-win solutions in anytime soon. I think that these two are probably going to have to just grapple and crunch and muscle it out until at some point in the future, and hopefully in that interim period without a huge amount of conflict, that they can manage this. But I think at some point there's going to have to become apparent how the relationship of the two has stabilized in some way, and that could go either way. So I think we will continue to see tension over cyber, over election meddling, over particularly on technology. I think that in the same way that I think Trump 1.0 set the bar for really focusing attention on China, and then Biden refined that with his so-called smaller yard, higher walls, and I think Trump will continue many of those. I think there's a momentum here, given much like what my colleagues said about India, this is also one of the rare issues that's bipartisan in Congress. I think turning to a couple of the other big issues, 2027, we will not see an invasion of Taiwan. I think this is often put out there. I think it's a misreading of Xi Jinping's words. I think particularly if you look at what's been going on circumstantially, all the PLA generals that have been wiped out, all the corruption scandals. There's great frustration on the part of Xi that this military is nowhere near ready for prime time. You look at the Ukraine, where many of the, basically the PLA is modeled and improved on Russian platforms and how horrible they did. And this idea that they have not tasted blood, quote unquote, they have not tasted blood since the Chinese Vietnam conflict in '79. It's a big issue. They keep trying to cycle people both through to the border with India and also through the peacekeeping forces to try to replace some idea of experience on the ground. So my fears, if you look kind of bigger issue, the things that kind of worry me about this relationship, one is the tendency to demonize, and I think you're seeing that on both sides. And as tensions increase, and you can see this throughout history, communication decreases, the stereotypes of both sides come, and Michigan, with all of its Chinese students and all of the wondrous history that it's had with ping pong diplomacy, knows that better than anyone else. Once you stop sort of reducing that people-to-people aspect, I think you just can really go down a bad place. And from a personal standpoint, what they've done, what China has done also to really reduce the number of journalists who can bring a bit more nuance to our understanding of the country, and analysts and think tankers is not good, their security focus. And finally, I think the nuclear weapon situation. China has greatly increased the number of nuclear weapons from an old doctrine where they just needed a few to prevent outright invasion, but that needs to be kept in context. China has about 500, the US has about 5,000. I think China obviously wants parity, but when you combine that, I think, with the lack of the US acting as a more beneficent global player, I think you have the potential for South Korea and Japan and others to start deciding that they need nuclear weapons too, and I think that's a bad road to go down. Okay, thank you very much, really appreciate it, and we'll take more questions.
Mark, thank you. That was awesome and also depressing. Let's turn to Ying right now. And Ying, as you see, is visiting us from Washington, D.C. Ying, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Professor Lin. Thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. And I really enjoyed what Mark had to say about the big picture evaluation of the US-China relations, especially in the next 4 years. So Mark and I, we conspired a little. So he was going to focus on the big picture problem, and I'm going to focus on more of the details or some of the actual ongoing discussions about what Trump's policy might actually look like. So I'll give it a try. But I have to say that so far, I'm sure, as everyone knows, what we're talking about is all speculation, because people suspect that not even Trump knows exactly what his China policy will look like, which will depend a lot on the interaction with China and how China respond to his policy initiatives. And Trump is famous for being unpredictable. And people suspect that during the second term, his unpredictability will be brought to a even higher level. And here's a reason I will explain very quickly. So two things we do know about Trump, that one, he loves deals, right? Mark mentioned this, the previous panel also mentioned this. He prefers a deal, but at the same time, it's not just any deal. It has to be the best deal for him, right? And from the first Trump term, what we saw was a very frequent very frequent exploitation of the principle of maximum pressure. And one of Trump's first term official explained it to me that the maximum pressure starts with Trump depreciating or depleting his adversary of his or her negotiation leverage, push his adversary into a corner, and propose a ridiculous price for the negotiation, and then negotiate down from there. So when we look at what Trump has said about Greenland and what he said about the Panama Canal, there are these speculations about him offering an impossible price, but will negotiate down from there because it's always easier to negotiate down, but it's much more difficult to negotiate up. Thanks to U.S. superpower status, it gives Trump the ability to make these people would say in some cases irrational proposals, but it's more broadly seen as a negotiation technique. And so when we think about the second Trump term, we're talking about Trump 2.0, how is that different from 1.0? We know there are some differences. At least on China, if we look at the first term of Trump, there was a very clear pattern. So in 2017, there was a pursuit of cooperation with China, especially on the issue of North Korea, which was identified as Trump's top priority. And people might recall that in April of 2017, Trump famously said, if China works with us on North Korea, the trade deal China was going to get is going to be so much better. And the Chinese did cooperate. We saw a number, I believe 6 UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, which was unprecedented. But then North Korea was engaging Trump starting in March 2018. Then very quickly, we saw US and China fell into the trap of the trade war starting in May of 2018. And this trade war escalated to what some people call the new Cold War in 2019. And all these were paving the ground to the January 2020 Phase 1 trade deal. And if you think about this pattern, if you think about the timing of each move and the timing of the Phase 1 trade deal, it was very clearly geared towards paving the ground for the November election. It was aimed at Trump's re-election, right? So the hope was that the Phase 1 trade deal will bring practical benefits to U.S. industries, especially the agriculture industry and the manufacturing industry, and that will give Trump the positive numbers for him to win in the November election. So one could argue that, well, we saw how close the election was in 2020, but without COVID, Trump probably would have won the re-election. So COVID was a black swan event that was not anticipated. So what does that mean when we look at the pattern? This time around, although some people in Washington have skepticism, but this is Trump's second term. He does not have another re-election to run. Again, some Washingtonians are skeptical of that prospect. We'll see how that goes. But the general understanding is that he only has 4 years. So this may not give him that long duration of 3 years for him to reach a best deal through a maximum pressure campaign if his goal is to reach a deal relatively early so that he can demonstrate to American people the benefits that he can bring to the people and to the country. So there's a question as for whether he will still use a relatively long 3-year period or even 2-year period. Think about the midterm election next year. Think about his need for the domestic validation of his policy and his wisdom. So one could make the argument that this time around he might want to have a deal with the Chinese sooner, at least not wait till the last year of his second term. And we all know that his priority, as he stated many times, his main priority on China is trade. A year ago, during the election campaign, he talked about 60% of tariff against all Chinese products. Well, if you look at across the board, currently, I believe on average, the tariff on Chinese products is, I believe, somewhere under. I need to double check the number, but it's definitely not as high as 60%. It's somewhere in the, believe it 20% around that frame. So this 60% would definitely bring the tariff to a new level. But then after he won election, if you look what he has said, is quite different from his campaign rhetoric. We know that in November, in late November, he made the comment that he would impose a 10% additional 10% tariff on Chinese products to the United States. And if you add the 10% to what is existing tariff on the Chinese products, it's still much better than the 60% that he vowed during his election campaign. So now the speculation is that, well, he most likely is not going to start on day one 60% of tariff on Chinese commodity, but instead he will take an incremental approach, probably take a smaller step on adding additional tariffs on Chinese products and see how the Chinese will come back to negotiate. And if you're sitting in Beijing and you observe Trump, you will see that, well, after he has won the election, most of the things that he has said about China is positive. He has said that publicly, US and China can solve all the world's problems together. And he has also promised to delay the TikTok ban for 60 to 90 days. This is something that Biden has refused to do. He issued the invitation for Chinese leader to attend the inauguration ceremony, which is unprecedented and has never happened before. And this morning, he also had a phone call with the Chinese president. And in his social media, he well, I don't know how to call it anymore. It's not a tweet. His social media post, he said, well, the call was a very good one for both China and the United States. It's my expectation that we will solve many problems together and starting immediately. We discussed balancing trade, fentanyl, TikTok, and many other subjects. President Xi and I will do everything possible to make the world more peaceful and safe! Exclamation mark. So if you are reading this post, you have to wonder that, are we talking about China? Are we talking about the most consequential strategic threat to U.S. long-term interest and global leadership position? Because this feels too friendly to be true. This is how U.S. would describe an ally, would describe a close partner. But this should not be the description or the narrative on China. But based on this evidence, we're seeing that at least by so far between the election and before the inauguration, Trump's comment and Trump's position on China has been exceedingly positive. Well, we also saw this in 2017, right? In 2017, if you recall, Trump's inauguration was on January 20th, and then his daughter and his granddaughter went to the Chinese embassy for the New Year, the Lunar New Year reception at the beginning of February. Then Chinese well, I believe the director of the Foreign Affairs Commission, Chih, came to visit in mid-March, which paved the way to the first Trump-Xi meeting in Mar-a-Lago at the beginning of April. So last time it started with a relatively positive, I would say very positive trajectory. And now this time we're seeing the same positive trajectory, at least early on in since Trump won the election. So what it means is that, well, this current positive interaction may not come too much, because in 2017 it was also positive, but it did not prevent the dramatic deterioration of bilateral relations later. And on the Chinese side, we're also seeing the Chinese are evidently willing to embrace these signals of goodwill from Trump and also reciprocate. The fact that China is sending Han Zheng, the vice president, to the inauguration ceremony is, well, Han Zheng carries a ceremonial role. He is not a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, but he is an extremely senior leader of China, right? He ranks number 8 among all the Chinese leaders, and he's a vice president. So it's symbolic, but it's also ceremonial, which fits the bill quite perfectly, because he cannot engage in any trade negotiation and he cannot make any position on North Korea. But in comparison, if we look at the Chinese private interlocutors, the Chinese government delegations that came through Washington in the month of December, most of these interlocutors are from a trade and economic background, including from the CCIEE, the China Center for International Economic Exchange, with a government think tank on economic policy, and also the Financial 40, which is a forum of the most senior financial officials or former financial officials in China. So I think that also sends a signal that China is extremely willing to engage in a trade negotiation, to rediscuss what the Chinese understand they did not implement the phase one trade deal. So there is a lot of willingness to discuss how the phase one trade deal can be reinvigorated, or even talk about the phase two trade deal. I would say we're looking at a relatively positive interaction so far between US and China at this stage. People talk a lot about the personnel appointment and what does it mean. And I got a lot of media questions at, well, Mark Rubio and Waltz, they're all China hawks. And my first reaction has been that, well, tell me who on Trump's team is not a China hawk, other than Trump himself, probably. So if all these people are China hawks, then China hawks are not created equal either. Like, we couldn't say that the current Biden administration, some of the key leaders on China policy, such as, for example, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, and Kurt Campbell, they also have been extremely hawkish on China, but there are different categories under the China hawk definition as well. So, for example, the Biden folks, the Biden China team is regarded as hawkish, but they're also seen as competition managers. It's a term that Wang Jisi came up with. They compete with China, but they also want to manage competition so US-China does not get into a war. And then on the second category, there's also a group of China hawks that are called regime changers. These are people who target the Chinese Communist regime, Chinese Communist Party as a problem. Well, as a problem for China and as a problem for US-China relations. And the argument is China is okay, Chinese people are fine, but Chinese Communist Party is a problem. So therefore, if that is a premise, then the solution to US-China problem will probably lie in regime change. And once you talk to the Chinese about the regime change, there's no conversation to be had anymore. And that's what we basically witnessed in the second half of 2020. And the last category is what some people call cold warriors. These are China hawks. They focus on competition. They're willing to even be confrontational in some cases, but they're not necessarily driven by ideology, meaning that they focus on competition, focus on deterring China and China's behavior, much more on how to instigate internal changes in the Chinese political domain. So if you look at, there has been a debate as for example, whether Mark Rubio is a regime changer or is he a cold warrior. And people just assume that because he is from Cuba, and well, if you're a refugee from Cuba, you probably do not have much affinity towards communism. So I think there is a speculation that he will be targeting the Chinese Communist Party regime as well, which would make him a regime changer. But if you look at what he has said so far as a senator and the bills that he supported, he's critical of the Chinese Communist Party. But I don't think there's a consensus that he advocates for regime change in China. He's extremely keen on competition with China, but whether the competition will eventually come back to regime change, I think that remains to be seen. And also, like Mark mentioned, that a key criteria for Trump's second term is these officials must be loyal to China, to Trump, right? They must be loyal to Trump's agenda, which some people speculate is some of the reason why some of the people from his first term was not selected for his second term. So if loyalty is a key criteria, then we would probably see that Mark Rubio will be following Trump's direction as for where Trump wants to go on China. And that's the other interesting issue, that what is Trump's foreign policy priority? If you live in Washington, you probably would agree that at any given time, a president or an administration cannot have more than two top foreign policy priorities, meaning that your attention, your resources, your diplomatic maneuverability cannot be equally allocated among three on more foreign policy priorities. And when you look at Trump's foreign policy priority, well, we know that he has appointed a special envoy for Middle East, and he also appointed a special envoy on the issue of Ukraine. And people, I think, rightfully assume that Trump's priority will be focused on ending the Ukraine war and also ending the Gaza crisis. Well, we have seen a deal on Gaza, but how that will transpire, I think that remains to be seen. So is Trump really able to target China as his top foreign policy priority beyond the trade? I think there's a skepticism that that will be the case because if you think about it, the special envoy on Ukraine and the Middle East, they are both situated. They're both seated at White House, which means that that is White House or National Security Council going to take lead on China, or is China going to be left to, for example, State Department and DoD as a key priority to lead on? We don't know, but we have seen what has happened with Trump's prioritization so far, and it raises a question as for where China will be delegated to. Last, just some observations about this transactions. Well, I always say that no one loves transactions more than the Chinese, right? You look at the history of U.S.-China relations, especially since the diplomatic normalization, most of that, I would say, is based on transactions. That U.S. does something for China, then China will reciprocate. And is also an ongoing, I would say, operating principle for the Chinese foreign policy operators when they deal with the United States. That, okay, what is the list of asks, and let's see what is our list of asks, and let's see what kind of deal we can make. For the first 3 years, or the first 2.5 years of Biden administration, the China team of Biden administration took this compartmentalized approach: compete, confront, cooperate. And they also made it very clear that U.S. is not going to make the concession in order for China to cooperate with the United States. I would say that for the last 18 months, we saw that changing. If you think about for example, China's cooperation on fentanyl, that was certainly based on certain terms being met or certain demands being met by the Biden administration. Is Trump going to accept this transactional approach? I think we will have to see, especially during the first term after the issue of North Korea, we did not really see much cooperation between Trump and China. Because Trump could also adopt the maximum pressure approach rather than the transactional approach. For example, when he talked about the 10% additional tariff on Chinese products export to the United States, he associated that with fentanyl. That if China does not control the fentanyl issue, I will impose additional 10% tariff on Chinese products. So there is this association already that we can see. The Chinese believe that they have leverage or they have issues that they can put up for transactions, maybe not a complete transaction, but at least a partial one. The first one is Russia, and the other one is North Korea. Some people talk about climate change as a potential issue for collaboration. I don't know to what extent that Trump subscribes to the issue of climate change. I think people are anticipating that climate change is not going to be his priority. And I also think that climate change has been portrayed as a poster child of U.S.-China cooperation. That whenever there's no cooperation, people say, oh, climate change, that represents the lowest common denominator and the issue that U.S. and China should cooperate upon. In theory, that is true, but in reality, we really have not seen that transpiring in reality at all. And then last but not least, there's a question of U.S. trying to make a deal. Well, the question is, make a deal about what? If you ask the Chinese, of course, they want to make a deal about Taiwan. But I think in Taiwan, there's some speculation that maybe Trump will want to make a deal with China. I don't think the Chinese believe it. I don't think the domestic politics in the United States, especially the U.S. Congress, will support that kind of a grand bargain. But we also know that Trump does not want a war with China. So most likely on Taiwan, there's not going to be a deal and there's not going to be a war. And we're going to see the gradual incremental increase of tension for the next 4 years. So there are still certain, I would say, even it is Trump, there are still certain laws of gravity that a US president cannot defy in Washington. We saw this in the first Trump term. He wanted very much to reach a deal with North Korea, but there were still certain lowest bars that he had to make in order to make the deal happen, and he wasn't able to the last time. So I would say that on China, such a consequential and strategic issue and such a priority for Washington, the chance of Trump to defy the law of gravity to reach any deal with China is going to be exceedingly unlikely, unless it is a trade deal. I think that is what people are most interested in and are looking for evidence for. So I will stop there. Thank you so much. Look forward to discussion. Thank you.
I'm sure we have lots of questions from the audience, and so while you are preparing to put your hands up, maybe I'll just start with one question for both of you, and that is this issue of Taiwan, but in particular Taiwan and the connection between America's policy with Ukraine. I think if you go to Asia, people never stop talking about how Ukraine is a harbinger of what might happen with Taiwan, how Ukraine is sort of a test case for Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think Americans really sort of see the connection in the same way that the Chinese and the Taiwanese do. And so I guess I'm wondering, my question for you is, to what extent do you think American policy towards Ukraine and Trump's, very interest in changing that should be read by the Chinese and the Taiwanese as an indicator of his position on the China-Taiwan issue? So, A, do you think that China and Taiwan are looking at Ukraine for hints about what Trump is going to do or how Trump is going to feel? And then maybe the second question, if they are looking at Ukraine for hints, do you think they're right? I mean, do you think you can find hints for Trump's position on China and Taiwan based on what he might do in Ukraine?
I'll start on that and then let you. I think, well, certainly Taiwan and China are looking at Ukraine without a doubt, very, very much so. I think, as Yoon had mentioned, that some of that wobbly nature of Trump's position and up until the first presidency, lack of knowledge about the Talmudic history of Taiwan and all the sub-documents that go into that. Even as a reporter, it's a very perilous place to go to. I think I saw it in the last couple of weeks, the amount of activity on the part of Taiwan to draw from the lessons of Ukraine, a lot more focus on self-defense, on how we would mobilize as citizenry to try to counter something like this. And then at the higher level, I think this is part of a grinding debate that's been going on between Washington and Taipei for years, but the idea that you need to have more of a porcupine strategy, that selling tanks don't make a lot of sense, that you need some of the cheap, very effective drone type equipment that we've seen work very well in Ukraine. The problem is, of course, lots of US congressmen and senators have big ticket military projects in their constituencies and want to have often insisted that these things be sold even if they're not. And then you have the Taiwanese military, which loves big shiny toys, and it's much less glorious to have little things that civilians can use rather than you. So, so I think that's some of that. I think the jury's out in terms of how Trump will do it, but I do think he is some of the principles that underscore U.S. U.S.-Taiwan-China triangle relations, including the need to protect freedom and some of these, the history of the nationalists against communism. I think it doesn't mean much to him. He's not very concerned with him. And as Yoon said, if there's a deal to be made, he will think about that. I also agree with her that he will. The Washington establishment, the support on the Hill is so great for Taiwan that there's only so far he can go.
I agree with Mark. I think the question of the comparison of Ukraine of Taiwan is an ongoing one. It depends on what are we comparing, right? Are we comparing the U.S. strategy? Are we comparing the end result, or are we comparing the techniques or the tactics that being used on the battlefield? I think if the question is that, well, it looks like that Trump is going to well, in some corners will abandon Ukraine. And if the question is, well, will Trump or United States abandon Taiwan? I don't think that U.S. will. I think there is a very clear conviction in Washington that if China invades Taiwan, U.S. will intervene militarily. Does that mean that U.S. will send troops? Well, that's a different question. But I think the going assumption is that U.S. will have to be directly involved in a Taiwan contingency, especially if the contingency was created by unprovoked Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Again, there's no vote on this issue, not on the Senate and not on the House. So we can only talk about the general atmosphere in the policy circle. But I think for the current administration, well, for the incoming administration, what we have seen a lot is the argument that let's not talk about whether U.S. will intervene. Let's talk about what Taiwan needs to do to defend itself, or what Taiwan and U.S. need to do jointly to enhance the security of Taiwan. And that's a deterrence-oriented approach, or I would say that's an approach that prioritizes deterrence, is to make the Chinese unsure and uncertain about the consequences of their invasion. That if they invade, they may not win, and if you may not win, why do you want to fight? I think it is to increase the doubt on the Chinese side about such a Taiwan contingency. But the question that I always have, and I always ask my Taiwanese colleagues, is that what is your vision of victory? What does victory look like? And it seems that with the Trump administration, a lot of expectation is that, well, increase your GDP, your defense spending to 5% of your GDP, and then we're going to talk. And then we can talk about Taiwan's national security. And I don't know if people do the math. So I'll give you some numbers. Taiwan's GDP last year was $756 billion US dollars, and this defense budget is about $20 billion US dollars. So if you look at it, it's about 2% of the GDP. But GDP is not the government budget. Government budget of Taiwan in 2020, well, in 2025, actually, this is from last year, is $103 billion US dollars, which means that Taiwan's defense budget is already 20% of their government spending. And now we want to increase it to 5% of its GDP, which will be somewhere around 38 billion US dollars, or 40 billion US dollars, and that would be 40% of the government spending, of the government budget. I just find that untenable. I don't think that Taiwan can afford, well, when you talk about 5% of GDP, it doesn't sound like a lot, but 40% of the government budget, that is a lot. And I don't think that Taiwan can realistically achieve that ratio anytime soon without significantly increase the taxation, the tax revenue of the government. So anyway, I just want to throw that issue out there. And I think how this deterrence can be structured and who's going to pay for it will be a significant issue for the incoming Trump administration. Thank you.
So I have a question regarding the minorities. So we saw during the first administration, President Trump signed the Uyghur Human Rights Bill, and then Biden has been very proactive, including Pelosi visiting Dalai Lama in India and all of that on the Tibet issue. We had the Resolve Tibet Act, which was signed by Biden. So do we anticipate these issues, particularly on human rights, being used as bargaining chip with China? Particularly, I follow the Tibet issue a lot, and I've seen a stark increase in visits by US officials to India, most of the time actually rather to meet His Holiness than Modi, and all traveling up to, in the hills, up to Himachal to meet Dalai Lama. So do you anticipate issues regarding the minority groups in China to be highlighted more in the next 4 years?
Do you want to start, Ian?
Sure, I will give it a try. Well, Dalai Lama was in the United States. He was in upstate New York for quite a while in 2024. I don't believe that he was able to have any meeting in Washington. I don't think he had a trip to Washington. I think there were discussions about maybe he should come to Washington and go visit the White House, but I don't think it happened. So I think one has to wonder that what happened there. The Uyghur issue and the Tibetan issue are going to be ongoing issues, even not a priority for the administration, which I assume they will be, because Mark Rubio is going to be the Secretary of State. And the State Department, I suspect, will be carrying a bigger role on the religious rights and human rights issues on China. But we are also looking at a US Congress that is extremely hawkish and hostile towards China. But it all depends on, it comes back to the issue of what Trump's priority is, right? If Trump sees that, well, I need to make a deal with China, I need to use these human rights issues as a leverage to push China further, then we probably will be seeing more actions on these issues out of the Trump administration. And given how popular Trump is and how overwhelmingly dominant he is within the Republican Party, I think Trump will be the most important and consequential voice on this particular issue.
I guess the only thing I would add, I don't think human rights are a big priority for Trump, obviously, with the exception probably of religious rights, because that is something that directly affects his evangelical base. And I think the added issue is that it will not be principle-based, but human rights are, whether it's the Uyghurs, whether it's the Tibetans, the Hui, there's many groups. It is a very effective cudgel to hit China with, and they know that this is something that they can immediately get the hackles up for Beijing, and so above and beyond anything, that can also be, if you're looking transactionally, something that you can trade off.
Please. A microphone's coming to you.
Do you think that President Trump's personal business interests, which include manufacturing in China, and also that of his daughter, Ivanka, who apparently has trademarks there as well, could play a factor in deciding American foreign policy towards China?
I don't, when you look at some of the deals that Jared Kushner was working loans early and during the administration, I don't think principle. We've seen this in many ways, right? With deals with Saudi Arabia, what have you. So I don't. It is a factor. It is a factor. Certainly, I think none of us can absolutely cut so-called Chinese walls between things. So I think it will influence. It will have an influence. Whether it will in any way affect enormous, huge deals between countries, I don't think it'll go that far, but it's there. Yeah.
I agree. I don't think it's going well. It was definitely a much bigger issue during the first Trump term. You saw the discussion. And by the way, Trump is not famous for manufacturing businesses anyway. It's all about real estate. So during the first term, there were a lot of criticism of his conflict of interest in China, but not for this time around. And if you look for conflict of interest, you can probably see from Middle Eastern countries that will give more evidence as for the potential conflict of interest. But so far, it has not been an issue.
Let me just add, yeah, real estate's not looking terribly great in China right now.
So my question centers around kind of the EV market and just kind of technology in the States in general, trading between China and kind of the States. I've just been seeing that, at least with this presidency, there's been an increase of kind of businessmen and tech investors around Trump's inner circle, with the prominent being Elon Musk and his new position as the Department of Efficiency. So we kind of see a lot of power for him. And I just wonder, like, as you said before, Trump kind of wants an amicable relationship with China, with the prospects of kind of joining hands for certain issues in the future. And I do wonder how this will affect kind of issues with trading for technology, since his inner circles are so kind of wanting disruptions and increases in tariffs for EVs, because that would improve their businesses and so forth. I'm just asking how you foresee the future of EV trading and kind of technology trading between the two partners.
Yun, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Well, if you look at Tesla, there are a lot of speculations about Elon Musk and what role he will play on China. So far, we're not seeing him playing a role on China policy. We're seeing that he's in charge, or he's spearheading this government efficiency initiative, which will be highly controversial, especially if you think about how the USG government agencies are going to respond to it. So I haven't seen Elon Musk being a distinct figure on China policy just yet, but people have hope, right? People have expectations that he might. On Tesla specifically on Tesla, the EVs Tesla produces in China are exported to European market. And if you look at Tesla's market share in China, it has been decreasing. It's not growing, because the Chinese-only EV producers are much more efficient, and especially in terms of the pricing, and they are gaining the ground and the market share in the Chinese EV factory. So if we think that Tesla is the knot that ties China together with Elon Musk, I have to be skeptical as for how sustainable that will be, and also at what point that it will become a point of friction, not just a convergence of interest. But for the foreseeable future, is most likely going to continue. Thank you.
I'd add just a couple of things. I think other than the big man, I think China has really tried to figure out how it can make inroads into this administration to try to have influence. Some of the people that they would go to the well endlessly with, like Henry Kissinger, are now dead, and those conduits are out. The business community is increasingly pissed off, I think, which was always a good lobbyist for them, with all the security and data and raiding of offices that have gone on in Beijing, and so they're less enthusiastic. Trump, I think, Musk has been an obvious possibility for the Chinese, but I think it would be pretty obvious if they tried to squeeze him on his Tesla Shanghai plants in order to get something. I think, especially given how erratic he is, and he'd go public with that, and then they'd be terribly embarrassed. And I also think, I personally am wondering what the longevity of Musk's position is in the administration. I think he's flying a bit too close to the sun. Trump does not like people that are called the real president and all the little snipes that we've seen. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I think is interesting on the EV issue is that basically, yes, the Chinese have become incredibly competitive with EVs, a fraction of what the US prices can be, and the Europeans. Okay, so you're starting to see the walls come up in Europe and in the US on this. The US has more or less blocked Chinese EVs completely, and the tariffs are rising quickly in Europe. So that has pushed China, I think, to sell more and more to the global south. And that is, I think, going to be a tricky one, because much of their ideological arguments and positioning geopolitically are the global south now. And you're starting to see that as these trade washes up into less attractive markets from the standpoint of Chinese profits, that you're starting to see tariffs start to rise in the global south as well, because given the Chinese downturn, they've had to export to try to really preserve the jobs. So it's this EV issue is, I think, very, very interesting, and I think has implications far beyond the actual trade numbers.
Maybe one more after this?
One question, and then I think, so Seema, maybe that's the last question, and then
Okay.
we have an entire roundtable in the afternoon where we could continue the discussion.
Okay. I was just wondering if you all heard Marco Rubio's testimony at the confirmation hearing. He brought up the issue of Panama Canal. He was asked about it. And he went into specifics that both ends of the canal, the presence of Chinese companies that have the presence of the Chinese state, in times of conflict or in times of trouble, they could just block the canal. And how do you see this issue playing up in the coming 4 years with the government of China?
Yun, do you want to?
Sure. Well, I mean, if Trump prioritizes the Panama Canal and he wants to make a deal with China over that, I'm sure the Chinese government will be very happily tell the Hong Kong company to withdraw its share from the two management companies of the canal. But coming back to reality, well, I don't think the selection of Panama Canal and Greenland was by accident. Both cases have very strong relevance for China's strategy, especially during the first Trump term. If you recall, Panama severed diplomatic relationship with Taiwan and reached diplomatic relations with Taiwan with China instead. And China has been trying to invest in Greenland and establish ties with indigenous people on the island. So I think these two cases are representing the issues or the geographical areas that's way outside the Chinese immediate periphery, but also at the same time demonstrate Chinese geopolitical ambition or potential geopolitical ambition, right? So I would not be surprised that the incoming Trump administration will prioritize these two issues some more. But then again, coming back to China, the Chinese will say, well, it's fair trade, it's fair deal, right? We reached a deal with the local government on these management agreements of the Panama Canal. Is there any cost that we need to pull out? We need to withdraw? Is the Panamanian government be willing to make that trade with the Trump administration? And what is Trump administration willing to put on the table? So again, I think for Trump administration, people's anticipation is that our negotiation is fair trade. So it depends on what issue that will be prioritized. Thanks.
And I don't know, I actually started my career as a shipping reporter and spent a lot of time with shipping. I guess this slightly falls into the category to me of what if or possible or what have you. I mean, I think because there's Chinese ownership of a container shipping terminal in the Panama Canal, I think you can see the very worst in that, and you can also see commercial reasons for doing it. One of the more absurd examples I covered, the BYD, Build Your Dreams electric company, which was doing buses in the Los Angeles area. And one of the arguments was that they, in the event of a war, China could have them shut the engines down in the middle of an intersection, and therefore we need to ban all of them. And the counter on that, which I heard online, was, or they could see how bad our mass transit is. So anyways, I see how you can, as our demonization happens, I'm just a little wary that everything becomes geopolitical, and sometimes it's not.
All right. Well, Mark and Ying, thank you so much for all of your thoughts on this panel. It was incredibly enlightening. I'm really looking forward to the discussion after lunch when we have the journalists and scholars from both India and China here. So if you are in this room, there is lunch available. And if you are not in this room, we hope you have a wonderful lunch and come back here at 1 o'clock. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Quickly, please, it's a quick lunch, 40 minutes if you can call it quick. And there is some delicious Nepalese food. I hope also some Tibetan. I know the restaurant's really good, base camp. So please enjoy and please be back by 1. Thank you.